Okay, good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. Again, thank you for being here. It's always an honor to be here and to introduce our speakers for the events and lecture series. But I would say today is a special honor because we are introducing a new book that just came out through Architecture at Rice from our very own Jesús Vassallo, Associate Professor of Architecture here in the school, and Sebastián López Cardozo, a recent alum of our program. So we're delighted to welcome them. The book is based on a symposium from 2020 that happened just before the pandemic hit. It's one of our, I think, if not maybe the last event in person before we sort of shut down our public events for the semester. So in that sense, the event and the book is much older, I would say, than the lecture series and event series this year called Engaging Pluralism. But nevertheless, it's also a very meaningful contribution to the lecture series because the book asks some very important questions about housing, but it also looks at another part of the world, not that far away from us here in Houston to Mexico, for potential lessons. And as such, I think it's a very important contribution. Oftentimes in the US, we think about how we can teach other parts of the world about doing something in a particular way or doing something differently. But I think the fact that, in particular, Jesús has taken the time and made an effort to actually bring others into the conversation and to see what we can learn from others is very important. As such, I think the book is a very important contribution to both cross-cultural dialogue, but also at the same time, it's important in bringing housing as an important topic for architects, in looking housing beyond just a program into something that as architects we need to contribute to and participate in a larger conversation as to how we can improve the way that people live about in the world. So without much more ado, please welcome Jesús and Sebastián to the podium or to the table, and then we will have time, plenty of time I should say, after their presentation for a questions and answer session. Thank you.
Fuentes Consortium, which is a research enterprise between Rice University and 4 different universities in Mexico, which gave us the grant that made it possible to have this event that Igor just described, and made also possible that we were able to start working on this book. And then after that, I also have to thank Interim Dean John Kasbarian and Dean Igor Marinovich for their continued support of the project, both materially and immaterially. Also, thanks are warranted to the graphic designer of this book, Luis Vassallo, who is a sort of a collaborator in many projects, and that I think again did a fantastic job of finding a design strategy that really foregrounds the architecture, which was one of the main objectives of the book, was to really foreground a body of work, and I think he did it in a very elegant way. And then finally, and most importantly, we owe thanks to the contributors. This is a book that Sebastián and I didn't write ourselves necessarily, but it's more of a collection of work, and everybody, all the contributors were super generous with sharing their projects, their ideas, and writing and taking parts in conversations with us. So, like Igor said, this was initially a conference. We were not sure if we wanted to do a publication or not. This is the poster of for the event, where you can see the people who took part of it. The ambition, as has already been said, was primarily to showcase a contemporary body of work happening in Mexico, with a very specific aim to center it as exemplary, right? With the idea, especially here in Houston, I think Mexico is always looming very large in our imagination. It's not only that it's very close geographically, it's also that Houston is a city with a large Mexican population. And it was, through the years, seeing all these projects being published, it was impossible not to think, okay, so why is the housing, the multifamily projects being built in Houston so formulaic, so dry, so conservative in their design? And why, in the other side of the border, every year you can see 5, 6, 7 really exemplary multifamily projects being published, right? So it was explicit that we wanted to say that Mexico is or should be a net exporter of design intelligence, and that specifically in terms of housing, it was really easy to make that point because of the sort of innovative quality of the work. That was the primary ambition. Then there was also a more selfish ambition, which was, I guess, to get a better understanding of what are the conditions of the production of housing for architects in the country. Right? So when you see a project published in a magazine or a book or a website, it's very highly somehow controlled, right? Like the amount of information that you get is very partial, right? Like you don't get to know things that are crucial to understand a housing project, such as who is the client, what is the price point, like is this a public project, is it a private project, etc. And so it was necessary to put together a group of people that could somehow also put some color and somehow give us context on the production of housing. So as you see in the poster, the people who we brought here were not only practitioners, not only people who had recently finished successful housing projects, but also people with experience in urban design, urban planning, developers, and also people who had served as public servants, who had been involved on the government side in producing some of these projects. So the event itself took place over 2 years, over 2 days, apologies, on March 5 and 6 of 2020. I think what was most, it was very well attended and very well liked. I think what was most successful about the event is that it was not only people showing beautiful projects, but that there was also a pretty deep conversation and a very high level of disclosure, in that sense that the speakers were all really frank and sort of thoughtful in the way that they opened up about the circumstances of these projects, who were commissioning them, how do these projects actually fit within the sort of development of Mexican cities over the last 10 years, how are the different cities different among themselves, the different cultures of architecture in the different states, etc. So we got really large amount of information in addition to getting to look at some very beautiful projects. As a conclusion of those days of conversations, I think one of the primary conclusions is that actually a lot of our assumptions were not correct, or at least a lot of my basic assumptions were not correct. It was actually specifically the sort of relationship between the public sector and the private sector. It was sort of something that became a little bit more clear in the conversations, by which a lot of the projects that we had looked at and sort of selected for this event, we understood them to be public projects. They were actually private projects, and how there was a little bit of it was interesting to have a better understanding of how those two sectors come together, or sort of don't come together in the production of housing. So that basically took us to make a series of decisions when thinking about a publication. So first, we were sure that we wanted to produce a publication out of the event, but the event didn't translate very easily into a publication format. And then, so in the end, instead of doing a more traditional book of proceedings, we decided to basically start from scratch with the preparation of the book. And we ended up deciding on a structure where basically the book opens with a long essay. There is a historical essay that gives a framework or sort of a trajectory of the evolution of public housing in Mexico, and we commissioned Sureya Segu and Armando Hashimoto to write this essay, and then basically that essay tells a little bit of the story of how the gradual winning out of the architecture profession from the process of the production of public housing in Mexico, and so sets the stage and the contrast with then the works that are compiled, or the projects that are compiled in the book, that are sort of more in the private side of things. So after that first essay, then the projects themselves are organized in three groups by scale. First one is houses, the second one is infill projects, and the third one is larger, sort of more in the mega block sort of scale. And this was partially, I think, as a way to capture thematically, we felt that it made sense to do it by scale, because different scales had given rise to different types of comments and different types of themes coming up in the conversations during the symposium. So for each of these scales, we reconvened some of the participants, and we had more focused conversations that then became part of the book as well. And then finally, I think after going through that process and putting together most of the book, Sebastián and I just wrote a concluding essay where we try not to have very strong, not very heavy-handed conclusions, but at least some takeaways of like what our reading is and what are some of the takeaways. So we will try not to give too much away, but at least give you a flavor of the different parts of the book. Like I said, the first third is basically this essay titled "What Collective? Mass Housing and Representation in Mexico," written by Soraya Segú and Armando Hashimoto, who together practice as El Cielo, but individually have taken on roles of quite large responsibility within the Infonavit and other sort of public entities. So they were speaking primarily as public servants in this case. And what they told us was a really interesting story of the evolution of public housing in Mexico through the decades. So what you see here is the Centro Urbano Miguel Alemán, which is maybe the most famous mid-century social housing project in Mexico by Mario Pani. And this is a moment in which, in the post-revolutionary stage or sort of period, the Mexican government really gets behind the idea of being the developer of housing, and also foregrounding architects and foregrounding modern architecture as a tool to generate this image of progress for the country, basically. So architects get to have a lot of protagonism, but they also get to have a lot of agency in laying out very large housing estates, full neighborhoods, and having actually a say also in the sort of distribution of functions in the city in a way. It's a very highly centralized model, very sort of highly top to bottom model, but the architect is sort of in command of the situation to some degree. Then what they describe is there's a shift a little bit later in the 70s where the government decides to not do the development of public housing directly anymore, but to somehow outsource it to a new entity called Infonavit. I'm sure you've heard about it, which is basically a tripartite entity where there's representation from labor unions, from the public enterprise, and from the government. And this becomes the vehicle for the funding of public housing in Mexico until today, basically. In its first years after being created, Infonavit not only grants funding, but also takes on development in a more direct way. And so here we can see a project by Legorreta from 1976 called El Rosario, which is a full neighborhood. And so this period is seen as a moment in which the model is slightly decentralized, so it can be more inclusive of the opinions and the sort of the agency of these three different actors, right? But still very heavily, but it's still with a very heavy involvement of the public sector. So what happens then pretty quickly as you move into the 80s is that there's a law that gets passed, and now we're getting into the Reagan and Thatcher years, right, and sort of neoliberalism kicking in. There's a law that gets passed that prohibits this entity, Infonavit, from being the developer of public projects, and it limits the role to just the production of publicly backed mortgages, basically. So they can only fund public housing, but they cannot control it anymore. And they become, and they still are, basically the generators of thousands of publicly backed mortgages that are given directly to the end user, right? So that means then that private developers step in to generate the housing that is then going to be subsidized through the final user. And that gives rise to a model, and I'm sure you've seen photographs similar to the ones that are on the screen right now, which is a model of single-family homes repeated along very large swaths of land. Right? So this is a model that is, on the one hand, quite efficient, right? But it's also a model that allows developers to make a lot of money because they can buy land far away from the city center that is very cheap, lay out these houses, in a really dense way, and then hand it back to the city. Okay, here is the new neighborhood that we've created, and the city gets saddled with a lot of the infrastructure component, right? So it is a model that has succeeded in the sense that it has been able to generate a very large amount of units, so the volume of production has been very high, but it also comes riddled with a lot of problems. And mostly that it's a model that very highly subsidizes private development to the detriment of public good. And so some of the problems are that these neighborhoods are too far out from the cities where the land was cheap, and so now you have low-income people living very far away from jobs. There's problems of vacancy because of the way that the sort of flow of money happens. And so basically what at that point also architects have no agency, because developers of course produce all of these projects internally. They don't go to architecture offices for advice. So architects are then called basically after the fact, after these neighborhoods are created and when the cities have to take charge of them to try and solve some of these problems. And so I'm sure you've seen there's been in the last few years a lot of very successful public space projects done in Mexican cities. Just last week we had Rosana Montiel lecture here at the school, and she had some really amazing projects exactly in that vein, where architects are basically asked to come to these single-family neighborhoods and try and fix some of the things that are missing. Add the sort of social infrastructure projects, add the sort of quality public space projects, etc. So basically, through the decades, the architect moves from being the leader of the production of public housing to being completely marginalized, and then taking on like a palliative role or a sort of basically trying to somehow ameliorate the sort of the rough edges of this approach to housing. So basically, I think this essay lays out a little bit the groundwork to explain why a lot of the work that is collected in the book is actually in the private sector, which is that the sort of architectural talent has followed resources, and as resources have moved from public housing to private housing, basically that's where the architectural sort of production and innovation has gone to. There's been, and like I said, similar to this type of public projects where basically they're working with public space and sort of adding cultural infrastructure, there's also another type of project where architects are called to design housing prototypes, right? And this is what's up on the screen right now is one of the more famous projects where the Infonavit called this series of highly progressive offices to produce different prototypes that would be each of them more suited to the geography and the climate of the different regions of the country. So trying to bring back some specificity and some design intelligence to the design of this single family sort of production model. So we felt basically that this is a type of work that is already showcased to a large degree, that is very popular. So I'm sure you've seen images of this project before. And there's a little bit of an imbalance because this is really representative only of a very small percentage of the public housing that is done in Mexico. And so we could have done a book about this, but we felt it was already well known. We could have done a book that would have been more comprehensive, but there have been also books in the last few years that I think are very good at painting a more comprehensive image. And I think credit has to go also to people like Fernanda Canales, who in the last years she has published 2 or 3 books that are really seminal and that I much better than our book actually. So if you really want to become an expert in housing in Mexico, you should read Fernanda Canales' book, not ours. But we thought that outsiders looking in, and because of the way that exposure has been allocated, that we could basically take on a more targeted approach, which is to look at the innovations that have happened in the production of housing in the private sector, and then try and see what lessons can be taken from that. And so I'm now going to pass along the microphone to my colleague to talk about the projects which are actually the core component of the content of the book.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. After the symposium, we set up a series of conversations with the participants, framed around the 3 scales that you see here, and we began a selection process for the projects to be included. From this comes one of the main topics of the book, which is how the architects of this generation in Mexico are working to redensify city centers while preserving the cultural preference of less dense forms of living. The format of the 3 scales also mirrors the general trajectory of the firms, which typically start making smaller buildings and then work into intermediary scales. In the book, we tried to give equal weight to all the scales, but the infill section ended up with the most weight. Each section of each scale begins with a conversation with the symposium participants on the topic of building at the selected scale, followed by a list of projects with photographs and drawings. The conversation around single-family housing looks at the cultural inclination in Mexico toward owning one's own piece of land and the relation to nature, as well as to the weight and feel of materials, ideas that inform the work at larger scales. In this context, single-family houses operate as prototypes, providing lessons of design that are applied in multifamily projects. As an example, Entre Pinos by Héctor Barroso, built amid a pine forest in the Valle de Bravo, divides each of the homes into smaller volumes or pavilions. The granular quality of the houses allows them to better engage with the landscape, as well as to mock up a kind of urbanism at a smaller scale. A more transitional project, Casa CBC by Estudio MMX, located in Mexico City, fits 2 almost independent dwellings around a courtyard in an infill lot. In the aerial image you see here on the right, you can see the dynamics of densification at play, with the original property lines and fences increasingly materialized as party walls. This project is a quintessential prototype for collective housing. The infill category, which makes up the largest portion of projects, has great applications for the rest of North America. Many cities in the US and Canada are confronting challenges in redensifying their urban centers. Typically, questions of character and preservation embedded in official plans and in political culture impede the proliferation of what has been variously called the missing middle. The conversation for the infill scale sheds light on the challenges of densifying while maintaining character. It presents typological innovations of pedagogical importance in a time where cities across the world are looking to redensify their city cores. Moreover, it reflects on the ways in which the architects of this generation in Mexico are collectively affecting the fabric of the city. Projects at larger scales take on typologies traditionally associated with collective housing. Mar Tirreno by Frida Escobedo in Mexico City, for example, rethinks the vecindad typology by arranging 9 units along a narrow courtyard. Spaces here are connected by a series of private and public staircases. And you can see a bit of that in the plan here. In IM8, located in Mexico City, Taller Héctor Barroso uses an open block type in an infill setting. Here, 4 small towers are grouped in pairs and joined by a bridge element that houses the circulation core. This composition allows for each unit to have its own patio. For its economy of means, IM8 provides the prototype for small multifamily apartments for the middle class. Another project here, the Departamentos DRL by Estudio MMX and Olga Romano, also in Mexico City. Here, six small stacks of apartments find a loose fit in a lot between party walls. In its treatment of open and built spaces, the project lies somewhere between a series of stacked pavilions in a courtyard building. Much of the energy of the project here is put into the intermediary spaces such as common spaces in circulation, aiming to open itself up. The last conversation, which is the larger scale, is the high-rise scale, sheds light on the idea that in Mexico, this type of project needs to generate its own public space. Architects often need to make up for a gap between the scale of the city and the scale of architecture. There's a constant fight to incorporate public spaces and infrastructure in their projects to make up for that very gap. In general, this section's conversation contributes to thinking of new urban forms. A good example of how this infrastructure is provided is seen in a project like Casa Tejada by Macías Peredo in Guadalajara. Here, the ground level takes on the scale and porosity of a public space. Thinking back to previous scales, this is also a project that deploys the idea of stacked houses. In this specific case, you can see in the plan, stacked houses stacked around the core. And it maintains a similar materiality and feel to a traditional house. So throughout all the scales, you may have noticed that there's a kind of similar use of materials that is maintained. In Rinconada Margaritas by Luis Alderete, also in Guadalajara, the open block type frees up the ground for massive green space. And you can see that quite clearly in the picture. This project, like others at the high-rise scale, leveraged the common services of a large housing project in order to give back to the public realm of the city.
So basically we just showed a couple of examples for each of these scale, and then in the closing of the book, we came up with this, in order to try to summarize what we thought was more, more maybe translatable or sort of more applicable. We came up with this idea of the de-individualized building, and so what we saw were a series of trends where basically this is just Sebastián and I like putting on more of the sort of architecture critic hat and looking at these projects, more transversally, and what we could tell is like, and again how these things sort of ripple through the different scales, where the first thing that pops up when you look at the smaller work is this sort of logic of pavilions, the fragmentation of the program of the house into its smaller constituents, and then how these become semi-independent volumes that then are, activating spaces between them, right? And this, like Sebastián said, this becomes like a decoy where they're able to make, they're able to create like a small urbanism that then has the capacity to scale up, right? And so they're already thinking at a very urban level, through this logic of aggregation, this sort of aggregation technique. Then there's sort of a seemingly contrary approach, which has to do with the generation of voids, right? And the sort of construction of housing through the subtraction of a central space or a courtyard, right? And this, on the one hand, comes from inherited tradition of the sort of culture of housing in Spain, and more specifically in the southern part of Spain with patio houses. But it also comes from the ways in which the Mexican code establishes the density that you can apply to a given site, where one of the things that is mandated is the amount of space that needs to remain void, right? And so it's interesting because it's somehow an opposite approach, which is not about the aggregation of pieces, but about the sort of subtraction of and the sort of maintenance of a sort of space of a public scale within the project, right? And then another sort of complementary sort of aspect that was raised and that you could see ripple through the different types of projects was the approach to nature, which we thought was really really interesting, really radical, but also very different from the traditional understanding of the relationship between architecture and nature coming from high modernity, right? So I think, at least in my mind, the idea about nature with modern architecture was that architecture should open up to establish a visual connection between inside and outside, right? So it's really, architecture opens up to become a visual device to frame nature, versus in these projects that also do that, it's a little bit different, where I think like architecture and nature are both understood as raw matters with which things get built. So they're both sort of complementary materials. It's a slightly different, I think it's a slightly different understanding of how those two things go together. And it's also interesting to see like first they're reduced to like a very sort of fundamental notion of what is architecture and what is nature, and then they're constantly put into contact and clashing. And it's interesting, I think, to see also like how you can identify these topics in the smaller projects, and then as the projects get bigger, the relationship between these three strategies becomes more complex and more hybrid, right? So, for instance, in this project that Sebastián explained from Studio MMX, it's a project that is between party walls, where they're sort of locating a series of freestanding buildings around a series of patios. So there starts to be a really complex relationship between an architecture that is more aggregative, and that is more an architecture of parts, and then an architecture that is sort of meant and understood as the creation of voided space. And again, where nature is introduced, even as they start to build higher, there's still this idea that you can always bring architecture and nature into contact with one another. So I think on the one hand, so this is maybe what we could describe as a sort of almost cubist approach, right, where the components of architecture are sort of broken down into their constituent pieces and then reassembled. This is partially about bringing the richness of single-family living into the multifamily scale, like we've discussed with the sort of approach to nature. But I think it's also a way to produce housing projects that are not so much monoliths but multiplicities, and that in being understood as ensembles of parts and as sort of multiplicities, they are enabled to enter into a different relationship with the city, a relationship that is perhaps more empathetic, and where there's more of an acceptance and a capacity to relate to both the order and the disorder of the city around them. And so I think in the end, I mean, this is a book that where we primarily see ourselves as outsiders looking in and trying to basically put the focus on the work of these offices and show them to audiences outside of Mexico. And I think it's really, we've both been impressed with the capacity of these architects to contribute through the practice of architecture to a larger conversation about housing, and we're like through this role of almost being like inventors of new types, they're actively producing change and sort of putting new possibilities on the table that are then being taken up by developers and by the cities, etc. And so I think maybe with that we can wrap up and hopefully have some time for questions. But before, I would like to at least once again show you the list of contributors, because I think they're really, the authors of this book are, the architects that have written for it and participated with their projects and their conversations. And if you're interested, I encourage you to read the book, because you're going to actually learn much more from learning to them than listening to our summary today. Thank you.
You have a microphone. Happy to open it for questions. Yes.
You have mentioned that there was kind of a code provision for managing voids in forms that were produced in housing. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Is that at a national level, or is it something that's kind of dictated by the jurisdictions? And I ask that because I was wondering if in your research, if there was a connection between that mandate and kind of like a regional language that happens in the projects that you found. How much does the local environment affect the form that's produced?
Thank you. So I may be wrong, because I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that you find this in different areas of Mexico, where there's a percentage of that has to be left unoccupied. There are these different coefficients: coefficient of occupation, coefficient of density. That sort of translate into different acronyms in Spanish language. And so that I think is consistent in all regions of Mexico. I think what you find is different urban cultures, right? That I think that's it. Mexico is a very big country. It's really diverse in its climate, in its geography, in its culture. It also has in Mexico, you're overlaying Spanish and European culture with very different native cultures, right? So you have the Mayas in the south, the Mexicas in the middle. That's another layer of diversity that occurs in the country. So in the end, when you visit the different cities in Mexico, they all have very sophisticated urban cultures, but they are not identical necessarily. You know? I think as in every other country in the world, things have become more homogenized with globalization and the Americanization of things. But I think, I don't know, I think maybe I may be wrong, but my sense is that code-wise is more or less, there are some commonalities, and then there are, you know, some cultural differences.
Thanks both for your talk. I might have missed it, but I was curious if, is it pronounced Infonavit? Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. Infonavit. Are they still primarily focused on the development of the single family home, like is in that Moss master plan, or are they opening up different sort of incentives for creating higher densities?
So I think, I mean, that's a very good question. So Infonavit is, to the extent that I know, is still focusing on even though with López Obrador there's been like a general switch in policy about everything, and including housing. Infonavit is also responsible for those projects that have to do with the improvement of public space and the addition of cultural and social infrastructure. So if you've seen, there's been a lot of projects published in the last couple of years that have to do with like open air markets, infrastructure for sports, etc. So those are public projects too. I think part of what we were trying to say with the book is, you know, look at these denser projects where it's like small developers and progressive architects teaming together to make these projects that are like prototypes. We feel like it would be amazing if the government would again, or Infonavit would again, take on the production of higher density projects, right? So.
Thanks again for the talk. I'm wondering, you know, you mentioned that there's similarities between Mexico and Houston in terms of like the different approaches, and there's also like that overlap in demographics that is shared between Mexico and Houston. What are some of the translatable lessons that could be learned from Mexico to Houston that you might, you know, that you saw in the different housing projects as they were presented, and also on the question of accessory dwelling units and micro-housing that is starting to, you know, kind of catch wind in Houston as well? What are some of the applicable ways and approaches that could translate between Mexico and Houston in that regard?
Maybe I can respond more in relation to Toronto, but with some applicability for Houston. But I think there's a lot of cities now that are trying to densify, and some of the resistance to densify comes from like people wanting their single-family home with the yard and the kind of it's like a certain cultural expectation of what your house should be like, and this happens in Toronto too. So you can have like, you can be in the middle of the city and have like a single-family house. I think that maybe one of the lessons of the book is how you can densify your a lot, but maintaining like the kind of you can like there's for example a project by some projects that will have like 9 units, but each will have its own patio, and so you kind of preserve that feeling of keeping like the same qualities of a single family house, but stacked into a more dense setting. And I think maybe that has applicability for Houston because there's also a kind of interest now in densifying and moving housing away from the floodplains and trying to pack things together more closely.
Yeah, the last question basically sort of stole my question, except I'm going to try to reframe it in a slightly different way. So I think it was a great question, and it's a little bit following on Brittany's question as well. So I think I know Jesus in particular, both of you are kind of working across the border and doing this project of translation for us, but also designers practicing in this situation here. And I was wondering, you've kind of framed a series of contexts, a kind of financial context in Mexico that like supports this kind of work. There's climatic work that's like creates a kind of context that allows a certain kind of porosity, like big envelopes, certain kind of labor context that's allowing certain work to happen, a certain kind of, as you frame, like a social urban context, like that varies across the regions, but nonetheless is like creating this work. So if you're thinking about what would have to change here, or what we would work on in that kind of advocacy to like make it possible for us to actually take these projects and learn from them and operate in this way here, or kind of mine the kind of what we call the kind of exporting of a kind of housing design culture from Mexico, like what kinds of things would we work on to make it possible to do these projects here?
That's a really, really good question, and I wish I had the answer. Right? I think maybe one big item would be risk avoidance, or the attitude towards risk. Right? I think housing. It's not only that it has become so highly commoditized in the U.S. It's also that the production of housing has become ossified into this process that is, highly averse to risk. Right? It's an investment. It has to produce a return, and anything that can disturb that possibility is immediately discarded. Right? So I think the attitude towards risk, is it also, you can see it everywhere. It's not just the way that capital is put together to finance a project. Is even like the detailing, where you can be more innovative in a detail. Water may come in. If water may come in, they will come in, they will fix it, and it's not the end of the world, right? There's a little bit, a slightly more relaxed attitude towards risk that I think makes a huge difference. And it has to do with the fundraising, it has to do with even certain, flexibility on the side of the cities, and a certain capacity to negotiate a little bit with the authorities, with sort of taking, construction decisions that, maybe, or you may be able to actually design a new detail for your project if you need to, and you're going to be able to make it work, because the builder is not, the contractor is not so worried about being sued that he's going to immediately say, no, I will not do any detail that I haven't done before, right? So I think people not being freaked out by getting sued makes the practice of architecture a much nicer thing. And I think that is different in Mexico. Exactly, exactly. We need to de-lawyerify architecture in this country.
I'm going to pass it over to Carlos in just a second, but since the mic made it back my way, I'm going to take the opportunity just to ask you another question, because it builds on these last two questions, and that is that I think in your book you write very eloquently about how the part of the, I don't want to say solution, but part of the reason why we see some of these experiments is that architects are at the table, like the state, whatever the state could be, right? They have a mechanism for architects to participate in these discussions and somehow influence how these projects are developed. But I would say also another part of the problem is that in the US we also have a stigma against collective housing for different reasons. I think it's not a dream for many people, it's a kind of a concern for many people. And I would say even in a very dense environments, like let's say Chicago, most of the people still live in single family units. So what do you think is the lesson for us, what we can do as architects to advocate and change the stigma of collective housing into something that's much more desirable for most people?
Well, I think some of the projects in this book actually do that work. I mean, they're so exquisitely designed, that they make that type of living desirable, right? I think again, like cities like Mexico, but not just the capital. I think the big cities in Mexico there's a very sophisticated and highly pleasant way of life in the city, right? Where people appreciate the possibility to be in the city and what that allows you, and this is something that came up in all the conversations during the symposium, right? The idea that it's you live in an apartment, but you're 5 blocks away from the museum, and then 1 block away from your favorite coffee shop, and across the street from a park, and 2 blocks away from a bookstore, and somehow what architects can do, I think, is like through design, and through having a higher ambition for the design of housing, they can make the sort of experience of everyday life in multifamily projects more agreeable, right? And I think it also has to do with this idea that they're always trying to bring nature into the units. Even if you're in a 6th floor, there always has to be like an open, an outdoor space, and you always have to have some possibility to have some contact with the outdoors. The problem of the rejection of public housing or collective housing, yeah.
I need to flip it to be green. There? Okay. No, I think this is very interesting conversation going on in the group here. And one thing I wanted to contribute to this phenomena of why Mexico today produces some of the best residential architecture anywhere in the world, and certainly put us often to shame with the quality that we build here. And part of that really comes from the extraordinary, I would say, complicity that exists between the developer and the architects and the builders. It's a very tightly related trinity. They're very closely allied, and that produces a kind of common goal that does not separate the quality of the works. The developer wants the same objectives as the designers, the planners, the construction, and I've seen that in particular in this group of architects, not only working in Guadalajara, but also in Monterrey and Mexico City. They really rely on that extraordinary relationship with the developer. The developer is not the one that rules completely. It's a symbiotic participation, and that's what produces the extraordinary quality, material quality of the work. I mean, here, if we're able to obtain some level, maybe 10% of that, I mean, you've seen some of these houses that cost the same or less than what we produce here. And it comes from the fact that the value is given in a different scale. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I think we have to remember that developers play an incredible positive role. And often the architects themselves become developers, mm-hmm. Or they use the agency of family connections or friends. And it's something that perhaps, I know we started maybe to do that in some modest way in our city, but I'm always in awe of how they are able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think with the smaller projects, you can see architects becoming the contractor is actually quite common in Mexico. And then I think the point about developers is very well taken. I mean, these projects wouldn't be so good without the developers being enlightened and being invested in the quality of the project. So here we have actually in this list of contributors, we have Re Urbano, who are, I think, in the capital city, in Ciudad de Mexico, they're the most salient example of this type of enlightened developer. But it is true that you can find a much less adversarial relationship between developer and architect in Mexico than in the US.
Hi, congratulations on the project. Very exciting. I wonder also, you talked a bit about scale and the limits of scale in terms of collective housing. So I know you started with the tiny Coupa project, and of course there are examples like Cardozo, and I think it's important to also maybe explain that these sites often have complicated
exactly.
And so you go to the sites that's also high vacancy rates. It's complicated. I think Kubernetes itself is one of those sites where you can go and there's still life, and there's just high,
Yeah.
it happens. But it's a very special case. And of course, it's a much larger scale than the projects that you're showing. So I wonder, just to integrate this idea of scale and limit, and what makes these, in your mind, successful projects that have longevity, when compared to some of these other modern sites that we have so well.
So when you say that these are successful, you mean the projects compiled in the book or the historic references that are...
Examples that you're including, the new contemporary.
The contemporary work, yeah. I mean, I think the reason why the middle scale got bigger and bigger, you know, versus the smaller houses and the much larger project is exactly because it's the better fit of what architecture can do when it works within established urban environment. So these projects benefit from being in neighborhoods that are very highly established and that have, you know, all the services and even all the amenities of the city, right? So the architect can just focus on making the housing piece very nicely, right? And then whoever gets to live there gets to enjoy everything that the city has to offer around it, right? As opposed to, you know, the sort of early modern projects where they were creating neighborhoods from scratch, right? And I mean, it's really hard from our standpoint today to think that you can not only engineer but social engineer a whole neighborhood and that it's just going to work without friction, right? I think, you know, projects like the Miguel Aleman are incredibly successful. The fact that they're still, you know, full of people and activity, and a lot of people love living there. I think the stigma of social housing and the problem of social housing is, you know, it happens in the US, in the UK, in Mexico. I don't know. I think for at least, I don't know what you think, Sebastián, but what you can see in the projects that are compiled in the book is that when they get to a certain size, there starts to be more friction because the city can no longer provide the infrastructure for a project of that size, right? And so when you get to projects like Rinconada Margaritas or these projects in Guadalajara by Macías Peredo and Luis Aldrete, and you talk to the architects, that's what they talk about. It's like the project this size we couldn't really do because there's no public space around it to support it, so we had to incorporate the public space in the project, and we had to bring the infrastructure, like the literal infrastructure, to make the project possible. So, and there's a point where it's just the relationship of the scale of the architecture to the scale of the city starts to break down a little bit, and the architecture starts to have to take on like too many things, right? So I don't think projects of the scale of those mid-century ones are possible anymore, or at Vassallo. It's a really good point. When we were sort of saying that, we're sort of talking about the sort of 60s and 70s, as exemplary, I think what we were saying is that what was exemplary was the level of involvement of the architect, right? That the fact that the architect was on the table, you know, being an active contributor of housing policy and housing implementation. Not that the projects themselves were perfect, right?
Yeah, thank you, Jesus and Sebastián. Earlier, I was able to catch a phrase that was like the American idea of property, like influence circulated into Mexico. There was also this pre-existing Mexican idea of property, and I appreciate kind of this acknowledgement because a lot of time we talk about property, like this constitutional property that comes from Europe and circulates to the rest of the world, but we don't really talk about the idea of other ideas of property that were endemic to other places and how these circulate globally as well. Like, say in Houston, everyone comes from everywhere else, and like we all patch our ideas of property onto like the constitutional. So, and thinking about that, and back to Igor, earlier you were asking how do we make this more dense collective kind of living more appealing or like acceptable, and there are ideas about convenience, proximity, all that is good, but back to this cultural idea of property. In these projects from all these protagonists, these architects, when they are designing something that is like non-conventional, something that is more dense, something like a high-rise or infill. Have you found that they have in mind that this idea of property, whether ideological or cultural, should be rejected, or do you think that there is this intention to preserve this idea of property even within dense living? Because I think sometimes we take it in oppositions. You either shed this idea of property, but can that be preserved? Because I think in some ways culturally property is important, because it somehow translates also to like a sense of ownership or authorship in one's life. So I would be interested to hear more about what your reflections were on that, and if there were any kind of post-occupancy reflections from residents as well in any of these projects that you've discussed.
So could you like summarize it? I didn't fully get it. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess to summarize a kind of main comment is the idea of property itself, whether it is American or Mexican or cultural or ideological. Do you think in an architectural exercise to encourage denser forms of living, should that idea of property be rejected? Does it evolve, or is it maintained somehow, even when the type is translating from a single family house to like a high rise? How do you find that idea of property evolving or resisting design?
I think the literal definition of property is just maintained, because at least in the project we're looking at, because when you go from single family to like multifamily, you just subdividing the property into different. But I think maybe more culturally or psychologically, I think there's a sense that you're sharing like the entrance with other people, so you have some collective spaces that maybe are not purely owned. So I think it's less literal, like yeah.
It forces you to acknowledge that you live in a society, right? And I think the architects in the book, they talk about that a lot too, about how the sort of multifamily is an opportunity to try to foster more communal life and more public life. I cannot say that I've seen like a radical approach to property in Mexico, like a sort of a rejection of the idea of private property or anything like that. I think in terms of post-occupancy, when I've had the chance to visit these projects in person, I've seen really happy people in these apartments. I have to say that was actually quite impressive to experience firsthand, to see how happy people are in these buildings. Really, really enjoy it. They're very good apartments and very good environments, and it's nice to see occupants being appreciative of the work of the architect. It actually gave me a lot of, it always gives me a lot of optimism when that happens. Yeah.
I think like something that has to be a big consideration is transportation and how that affects housing. Like I know in the States it's a lot different because we have so much bigger land, and because of that there's a higher concentration on privatized mobiles. If anything, more than other countries, there's like a reward for buying your car, for like purchasing new forms of transportation, and I think that contributes to why there is so much urban sprawl. Like people are more inclined to live in the suburbs, and I think housing, while there are beautiful solutions, I think transportation does play such a big underlying role in why we're unable to kind of make that shift towards integrating our lives into the cities. And maybe, I don't know, I think that depending on these underlying conditions that every country kind of faces, like for us, everything is so spread out here, and maybe housing has to be more integrative to the amount of land that we have. But maybe it can be done in a way that is more environmentally conscious, where we're more focused on creating, maybe they are larger structures, but maybe they're more focused on multi-generational housing, so that way it's more efficient. And in like places like New York, where there is that denser quality, in Chicago, there are so many abandoned spaces, and maybe like adaptive reuse would be the solution. I think that like the solution to housing has to be so subjective to the place that you're studying. I don't know if it's necessarily like the architect's responsibility, but maybe a larger community sense.
I think you're right. I think that's partially why I think housing is such an interesting topic, because it allows the architect to engage conversations that are larger than architecture, right? And have to do with policy. I think increasingly, we are learning to always look at housing, through these other lenses, the intersection of housing and mobility, the intersection of housing and health. And so I think housing is a very large piece of any public policy, right? And you have always to look at it in conjunction with all the other angles.
Phenomenal in that they study things subjectively. Like, it's interesting to see those solutions working from a single family unit style and the way that they just accommodate each type of environmental situation that they're placed in. And I think that's something that we have to take into consideration rather than taking a very formulaic approach and saying this works here, let's implement it somewhere else. Whereas like there are so many factors for each independent city, and since America is such a huge place, like one city like Indianapolis would probably be bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Like, it's just so sparse and it's hard to control that all of these factors have to be thought of so stringently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you're right. I think in the US, housing has become, like so formulaic that you find the same project being built everywhere, right? And that only makes sense to a certain extent. Yeah.
Maybe one more question. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. You mentioned Mario Pani and how that was just a very top-down approach to housing, right? Very centralized. And I wonder, where would you put these firms in that top-down scale? That's the first question. And then the second question is, if there is a bottom-up approach to housing, and kind of considering the fact that, Mexico, maybe the majority of the construction happens by self-building, or even the builders themselves, building for their own selves. And that happening here in neighborhoods, for example, in Houston, in Aldine, right? That the majority of Aldine is construction jobs, and on the weekends they have like these beautiful buildings and structures which are not traditionally considered architecture, right? But they're still very creative. So that self-building part, and then that, where would you put these firms in the top-down approach of that?
I mean, I think these firms, or architects in general in Mexico, have been entirely left out of the production of public housing, right? Like basically because it was delegated to the developers, and there's not a very strong oversight system, and so the developers just produce the architecture internally, and sort of the architecture profession then, like we try to describe, basically is then trying to come back in after the fact and somehow fix the bigger problem. So I think. I mean, some of these architects have been involved through public service in different positions, but I don't think they partake of that. I think the fact of self-construction and informal urbanism is huge, obviously, in Mexico. So the state was never able to meet the demand for housing, and the only way to meet the demand for housing was to let people, through these sort of illegal, what they call invasiones, right? They would come in, build for themselves, and then the state would actually sort of make it legal after the fact and come in and pave the roads and come in and bring the water, because otherwise they were not able to add. It was like, there was a point in a lot of Latin American countries where no government would have ever been able to add the amount of housing, with the exodus from the country to the cities. It was so violent that it would have been impossible. And so informal construction, informal urbanism, self-construction had to be allowed as the only option that they felt they had, right? And it's a reality. And I think in Mexico right now there's a lot of thinking about what you do with that. And actually Surella and Armando are really, I think pretty deep thinkers. And if you're interested in that topic, they have really interesting things to say about how can architects contribute to that process. I think maybe that's one of the more interesting parts of the current president's approach to housing. So López Obrador is a populist, right? And he believes in supporting self-construction and empowering the end user. I don't know how that experiment is going to pan out, right? So it was starting when we were doing the book, so we don't know really if it's going to be a disaster or a work of genius, but it's something that is being very actively worked and considered. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you for thoughtful questions. Thank you to Jesus and Sebastián for a wonderful presentation of the book. We have a couple of actual artifacts over here. If you want to come closer and check out the books, please feel free to do so. It's a busy week. We have a couple more events coming up, so it's not the end of events this week. On Friday at 5, we do have a homecoming reception here in the Parish Gallery, so please join us for that. And then on Saturday, Juan Jose Castellón is going to open his installation at the Post, so please make sure to come and visit us over there as well. And again, thanks to Jesus and Sebastián for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.